this is a question that is always put to me, and I have made this statement, and I make it again, that I would only consider entering the parliamentary fight if I felt that the situation was such
Paisley,
that I could do
Ian
nothing else.
Richard Kyle, 23,922. Ian Richard Kyle Paisley.
The thing about Paisley is that he's very successful on one level and very unsuccessful on another level. He is successful in that he has built a party and a church which represent a great many Ulster Protestants, and he has challenged the official Unionist Party and the established churches. He's doing quite well in that respect. On the other hand, his faults are the same faults as those of Unionism. He doesn't have a wider vision. He is very good at getting support within the Protestant community, but he is absolutely hopeless, proved hopeless, at getting support for the Unionist cause outside it.
Permit me to say how much I...
In fact, you'll hear a lot of people saying that really he is a menace to the Unionist cause because the various protests and the stunts that he comes off with really harm it because they lose influence elsewhere in the world.
The members had seen it all before, but this time the atmosphere was nastier, and it was Euro MPs more than security men who bundled the DUP leader from the chamber.
Now, these different perspectives on Paisley are not readily reconciled just at the present time. I think that all that we can do is identify them, that there's a plus side on the terms of the Loyalist analysis that the campaign is to edge Northern Ireland into a united Ireland. In terms of the Loyalist analysis, then it has to be said that he has served the province well. If you take a different perception, then you'd have to say that his reactionary campaign hasn't actually benefited unionism.
We have a weapon that is unbreakable, unshakable, and irresistible. The unity of the Loyalist people.
It is a complete betrayal and capitulation by Captain O'Neill to the enemies of our Ulster Constitution, the Republicans, the Romanists, the anarchists, the communists.
From time immemorial, there has been this siege mentality that if you change at all in your attitudes, you're weakening your defence. And that goes 3 centuries back and is still there.
And let me tell him that Ulster will not bow to him!
Paisley got his start because the Unionist Party was itself changing, becoming less fundamental, less religiously orientated under Terence O'Neill. Once that started, once there was an ecumenical flavour came to be attributed to unionism, that gave Paisley his inroads, because he could then argue that this was against traditional unionism, which was based on a very strict religious political segregation.
What's your comment on this?
And I think it helps explain the way reformers have been treated in unionism, the way anyone who tried to begin to accommodate got short shrift. And Ian Paisley was to the fore in making sure that such reformers bit the dust very fast.
Have been giving a markedly emotional welcome to the big man in black as he barnstorms through their constituency seeking their 23,000 votes. The bookmakers reckon it'll be a close finish between the Reverend Ian Paisley and the official unionist Bolton Minford. Minford is a family doctor from Randallstown with an easy bedside manner.
Oh!
Paisley, at public meetings nightly, he's been appealing to their fears rather than to their hopes.
He claimed that inevitably arising out of the civil rights campaign there would come a new wave of IRA violence. Now, the difficulty was that because of the way he had conducted himself in the mid-60s, it was easy for him to be typecast in the role of an ogre when the civil rights campaign came along, so that in a sense Paisley's actions lent a certain credence to the civil rights campaign, because it appeared not only were the civil writers complaining that the Roman Catholics were oppressed, that they were an oppressed minority, but there was this visual image on television of this Protestant ogre who could personify that kind of oppression and sectarianism and bigotry.
The government is taking no chances. An array of government ministers has come down to join Minford on election platforms. These ministers realise the world publicity a Paisley victory would get. They know it would be seen as proof that Stormont had failed to carry the country with it.
Nevertheless, Paisley managed to break through the resentment and antipathy towards him, because the simple hardline loyalist analysis that the Civil Rights Association would lead to an IRA campaign was in fact vindicated by the march of events. So in a sense, Paisley's rise to fame in Northern Ireland rested in part on an analysis which succeeded.
These are the first elections in the North in which 18-year-olds have had the vote. Will they show that youth has a new attitude to the problems facing the community there, or will they show that bigotry is like looks, hereditary?
But tonight, the band-side electors have given to me not only a vote of confidence, but they have given to the government notice to quit.
Well, there's two of us. The Stormont government are trembling already. I don't know how long they'll last, but certainly when we get into Stormont, we're going to tell them a few things, and I believe that this is a great message from Bandside and South Antrim, telling Chichester Clerk to get back to his farm and state.
But we will not hesitate to take strong action against any other individuals or organizations who may present such a threat in the future.
Brian Faulkner has less respect in the country than Major Chichester Clerk has. And I would prefer Major Chichester Clerk staying on than Brian Faulkner being Prime Minister.
Paisley's target, his target every day when he wakes up in the morning, is how can I do down the official Unionists? He is perpetually number two to the official Unionist Party. It stands between him and complete leadership of Northern Ireland Protestants. Because of that, his first tactical consideration always is how to eat into official Unionist strength. That is the thing that guides him on a day-to-day basis.
Then he joins the cabinet of Major Chichester Clerk and becomes one of the apostles of the so-called reform programme.
Paisley, just like he cried traitor to Protestant ecumenists, was very quick to jump on the political equivalents. In the first instance, Captain Terence O'Neill, as an example of someone who was selling out the cause of unionism and someone who had to be opposed. And of course, there was a great well of support there for that type of hardline support. Paisley articulated it, to a large extent led it. And the result, of course, was the fracturing of unionism from being more or less an all-class monolith and had no real opposition within Protestantism, within unionism, to being a political force that was split in 3, 4, 5 ways.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, fellow loyalists,
Number one, that the Irish...
It could be argued that he was, in a very real and literal sense, a one-man band. I find that he's a person who finds it difficult to cope with people of rival talents within the loyalist camp. He has never developed any kind of team approach to the political situation.
Loyalist action group to devise a...
Mr. Craig must realise that if he's going to be independent, he can't be British.
Men and women that you can trust implicitly.
The Democratic Unionist Party is particularly grieved that Mr. Craig should see fit to misrepresent our position by suggesting that we made a proposal for power sharing in the second tier of the executive. The truth is that we put forward no such proposal.
This power arose in two interesting respects. In the first place, he was able to come back and say, look, I've been over to Westminster, and if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't go along this particular line, follow this particular line of thought. That was one way in which party policy could be changed at the word of the leader. But another way in which it happened was the perception that many of the members of the DUP had of Mr. Paisley himself, because many of them were Protestant fundamentalists who believed with considerable depth and passion that Mr. Paisley had been raised up by Almighty God to lead Ulster in its hour of crisis, and therefore, in a sense, to challenge Paisley's line of argument or the rationale for his conduct was, in a sense, to challenge the one that God had raised up.
Which we as Ulster Protestants will not tolerate.
Dr. Paisley, what exactly is it you're trying to do with your organisation and your movement?
We're trying to preserve the Ulster Constitution as set down in the Ireland Act of 1920 and to maintain ourselves as an integral part of the United Kingdom. That is out of loyalty to the Protestant Revolution of 1688 to 1690. And we believe that the British Constitution is a Protestant Constitution, giving to us all the privileges and liberties that Protestantism stands for.
Now, you say privileges. Does that not mean that, in fact, you're setting up two kinds of citizenship, where you have the privileges and the others don't?
Oh, no, Protestantism is not like Romanism. Romanism, when she is in the majority, would deny the Protestants the liberties that they should have. Protestantism is prepared to give liberty to all, inside, of course, the law. And liberty must never become license.
It's not yet known just how many of the North's 1,800 public houses open for the 2 hours over lunch and 3 tonight permitted under the new laws.
For you to say that it's open forever is nonsense. We believe in the power of the Spirit of God to give people a drink of water. And when they get that water, they'll never thirst again for John Barleycorn or the devil's buttermilk.
He is, above all, true to his origins. He started off as a street corner preacher and a fiery revivalist, and he's still that, first and foremost. His protest against the Pope showed it.
Would you do the Cozy Bar, 44 O'Meath Street?
And there's something touching in the fact that for the past 8 to 12 months, he's been turning up almost every Saturday, often after a week of shuttling between Westminster and Europe, outside the City Hall in Belfast, to an audience of about 20 people, his hardcore religious supporters, Free Presbyterians, who possibly aren't in the DUP and possibly would shun it as a political manifestation and ungodly, and who stand there to listen to him preach. And he doesn't make political speeches. They are straight fire and brimstone Paisley speeches, sermons as from the early days, where he harangues the passing crowd to stop and bethink them that their days are numbered. And it's replete with biblical references, and it's vintage Paisley. And it doesn't appear to be for anything else but to do what he is best at doing, and what his conviction is that his whole political career is about as well, which is the preservation of Bible Protestantism.
I happen to believe in the power of God. I have seen public houses closed on the Ravenhill Road. There used to be a very big public house called the Raven Bar. It's not there anymore. I have seen the worst drunkards in my own district converted. I have seen publicans converted through my ministry who closed their public houses.
The Anglo-Irish Agreement was deemed accountable for this latest innovation, to which Ian Paisley's Ulster is saying no. And then it was off to picket another pub.
All the best. All the best to you, dear. Bye. Bye.
How are you? You well? Come on, Paul. Look after yourself. Doing well.
You have to remember that the heart of Paisleyism is the Free Presbyterian Church. He cannot get away from that, and that is a very fundamentalist organisation which really has no time for compromise. He has preached against compromise, and his congregation, were he to compromise, would be very worried about him. It would shake the whole structure, the whole edifice of the church, which is, of course, his heartland and his financial strength as well.
You've said that your new church now is to be exclusively for religion,
Yes.
no politics. To what extent do you think politics and religion overlap in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think that's a very foolish question for one Southern Irish man to ask an Ulster man, because we know that the Roman Catholic Church has taken a political stand in this island. And the Roman Catholic Church does not recognize the Constitution of this country nor bring her people up to recognize it or honor it. And as long as the Roman Catholic Church adopts this attitude, we as Protestants will resist the encroachments of the Roman Catholic Church into all spheres of activity. And let me say that as far as preaching the gospel is concerned and declaring the tenets of Protestantism, this is not politics at all. This is New Testament teaching.
When you listen to Paisley's sermons, in some ways they are supposed to clarify things for his congregation, but in other ways I think they're supposed to mystify. He constantly makes references to abstruse theological commentators. He constantly tells them really that there are things that they, as the audience, as the congregation, will not necessarily understand. But he also projects to them that he understands these various mysteries. And really what he's saying to them is they have to trust him. It's no point really for his congregation in trying to work these things out for themselves. His message, his subliminal message in the sermon is, follow me. I won't necessarily explain all these things to you, but my leadership will take them into account.
In regard to defending the Constitution, this is the duty of every patriot. I believe a Christian is a good patriot. And I don't think it's a political question defending the Constitution. Party politics, of course, are out as far as this church is concerned.
Headquarters. Remember that basically, because of their firm and strict Calvinistic, Puritan, anti-papist attitude, the Orange Order, the Paisleyites, and indeed a great many people who are Unionists, have much in common. The only thing is that Paisley could see that he could plough fertile ground and turn the prejudices of a whole population in Northern Ireland to political advantage. Well, he's been a member of the Northern Ireland Parliament. He's been a member of the House of Commons at Westminster. He's a member of the European Parliament. No matter what election there would be for an assembly in Northern Ireland or for Westminster or for Europe, he would win, because he articulates what I think is the basic unreformed views of the Protestant population of Northern Ireland.
What evidence is
Well, what
there?
about the hierarchy of your own church, who said that the EEC was an ally of the church and it was 3 Roman Catholic statesmen that were its heart attacks? But you know, those are the statements of your own bishops. Do you not accept what they say?
We're talking about the
So I'm a good
EEC.
Protestant. I'm accepting what the bishops of your church say about the common market, and you're denying it. I have a little more respect even for the bishops than you have, sir.
Well, that's a very interesting period in Ian Paisley's history, in the history of his church, because the theology of the Free Presbyterian Church suggests that the EEC is the fulfillment of the book of Revelations, which foretold the confederacy of the beast, and that this would be a Rome-ruled, papacy-dominated entity which would precede the second coming of Christ. As such, Free Presbyterians should have nothing to do with it. Partly or mainly because their theology also teaches them that they must keep separate from anyone who is tainted at all either by ecumenism or by Catholicism. And they quote the Bible, "Come ye out and be separate." Don't have anything to do, don't mingle, don't mix, shun the company of people who are not saved.
And Shirley Williams, I think, spelt it out prominent Roman Catholic. She was Minister of Education in the recent government. We will be joined to Europe in which the Catholic religion will be the dominant faith, and in which the application of Catholic social doctrine will be a major factor in everyday political and economic life.
So by the theology of his church, Paisley should have kept well away from the European Parliament. He should not be mixing. He should keep himself separate from them. But of course it was a perfect opportunity to amass a very large number of votes.
We'll be outnumbered by 100 million Roman Catholics in Europe. Well, we'll need to have a Protestant there to hold up the Protestant flag.
There was an enormous fight in his church at the time as to whether he should go, with doctrinaire people inside his church insisting that he keep away from the place. But Paisley, the pragmatic politician, had an eye for the main chance, and a lot of votes got his way at the end of the day, and rationalized it by saying things like, we'll go and milk the cow dry before we slit its throat, and that sort of thing. It was a perfect example of Paisley's ambition and his pragmatism overcoming his principled theology and him getting his way.
The three enemies of traditional unionism, the IRA Sinn Féin, the SDLP, and the Cardinal, have all put on record that they view one party and one person as standing between them and getting the objective of a united Ireland. They say they can do business with other unionists and with other unionist leaders on this issue of a united Ireland, but they can't do business with me.
Just over 100.
That's not bad. Not bad. It's just like a good steady trickle, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
You fellas breaking the law, you know. Don't do that, sure.
They went right in and photographed them voting.
From the start, Ian Paisley's clearly loved being filmed, loved being interviewed, loved being broadcast.
Get knocked down here. People walking backwards.
While simultaneously hating the people behind the cameras and the notebooks.
What are they doing here? Well, first of all, they're infiltrating all the media propaganda. For instance, the BBC this morning.
He's got all the dread of liberal, lefty journalists that most fundamentalists have.
So we find that the mediums of propaganda are infiltrated by Rome. For instance, the Belfast Telegraph is so much opposed to Protestantism that
he thinks of us, the media, as pagans and as running dogs of the IRA until proven otherwise. And I don't know that he's ever established a close relationship with any media person.
I'd like you to define what you mean by that.
Indeed.
If you would. Yes.
But he must have them. And it's not clear how much of that is ego and how much of it is conviction that as the man of his people, sent to save his people, he must be heard and he must be seen.
Press, like the Belfast Telegraph in the newsletter, sought to use their powers to crush my voice. You stood with me.
Paisley, Ian Richard Kyle, 230,251.
In the sense that the Pope is the absolute ruler of the Catholic Church, in the sense that his wish is usually translated into practice, so it's the same in the Free Presbyterian Church with Ian Paisley. He's been moderator of the church now since its foundation. He wields enormous exclusive influence inside the church, to the extent that that most times, 95% of the time, he gets his way on very crucial issues, whether they be theological issues or political issues which may clash with his theology. It's his church, everyone knows it's his church, and it's, I think, an appropriate description for him in those terms.
He defended the role of Christianity in public life.
And they're going to hold up the Roman Catholic flag, and not only hold it up, but they're going to make it a major factor in everyday political and economic life. Well, I'm going to hold up the Protestant flag.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
But the future for Northern Ireland is not by rebellion, is not by cutting off our links with Great Britain, and is not by adopting an attitude of plain stupidity.
A lot of the time, Paisley says that he is fighting to be British, and at one stage in his career, the policy he advocated was one of total integration with Britain.
I certainly say that the way for Ulster is complete integration with
At the same time, you only have to talk to anybody in Britain to realise that they do not regard this man as British at all.
Independent British Ulster is, number one, a paradox.
20 years and more of attacking the successive British governments have really lent an entirely anti-British tinge to him.
We reject the authority of Her Majesty's ministers in this province. That is absolutely correct.
He sees Britain as a much too liberal state. He's against the various social laws that apply there. He wants Northern Ireland to be different.
And the people in Ulster will decide what sort of government we'll have. And the politicians in Westminster will have to accept.
In one sense, Paisley would say that he is British.
Government.
But it's very obvious when you look at it that it's a very conditional loyalty.
I believe in union with Great Britain, and I must take Great Britain when it's foul weather or Great Britain when it's fair weather. I don't change simply because the British government is not so good. For my loyalty is not to the British government anyway, it's to British principles.
And strengthens them.
That's our message for you, Mrs. Thatcher.
His particular loyalty is also conditional in a religious sense, because he has said that if the Crown should ever cease to be Protestant, his loyalty to Britain would cease.
And the Queen, of course, is a Protestant.
In other words, if Prince Charles should convert to Catholicism and then become king, Paisley's union with Britain would be over. So really, you're talking about his use of the union. His vision of the union as a tactical alliance. And what lies behind that is not an attachment to the union as such, but really a use of the union itself as a tactic to stay out of United Ireland.
They must be taught a lesson that they can't govern without our help. And when that help is taken from them, then they are going to be taught a very serious lesson indeed.
Paisley is very, very good on tactics and pretty poor on strategy. On strategy, he has helped to lose a great deal of British and international support for unionism. On tactics, he is excellent. Paisley has a whole repertoire of tricks and tactics which he uses to further his political career. You'll see him at Westminster, you'll see him on the streets with placards, making protests and publicity stunts, which really get him a lot of coverage and which help to reassure his grassroots that he's the Ian Paisley that they know. On other times, quite close to this sometimes, you'll also see him as the negotiator or the potential negotiator. You'll see him dropping hints to secretaries of state that he would be quite generous and be quite prepared to make concessions when he comes to the conference table. Of course, when he arrives at the conference table, that never happens. But the tactic, that helps him to eat into the middle ground of unionism, and that helps to draw support from his great rivals, the official Unionist Party.
I warned them that this would happen, Mr. Mallon. I told you I wasn't pulling chestnuts out of the fire for anybody. And I'm telling you, more is in store.
He also has the religious card because his Sunday sermons are very electoral, highly political, as well as just religious. These are all weapons in his armory.
Let's have a vote.
Ian Paisley, from the start, has been declaredly loyal to the Crown being Protestant rather than to Britain. He has never at any time suggested that he has any loyalty or affection or respect for a British government, much less Parliament.
And that is the attitude of an arrogant dictator. And he'll be taught manners and he'll be taught sense before the end of the day.
He's varied between loathing of Parliament and mocking.
And I will be putting to him that we're not going to tolerate what's happening in this province any longer for him or any other appointee.
Mocking the effete decadent behaviour of MPs. And I think that's partly because he still has this unresolved tension in himself about being in politics. At the start, he made it very clear that he was having a long wrestle with his conscience about going into politics, and that he believed he ought to be a minister of God, first and foremost, and perhaps exclusively. But the Britishness thing, Paisley's Britishness, is, I don't think, has ever amounted to anything more than a conviction that the British link is essential for the preservation of Protestantism.
I want to say to you that you are my people.
And we also believe that the Unionist Party, for their own reasons, have been prepared to discriminate in housing and give the best allocation of houses to the Roman Catholics and let the Loyalists stay in what are almost slum areas.
Oh, the best man ever was. Best in the world.
I think there's badness in him. He hates the Catholics, and he's just for violence everywhere, and he isn't going to stop anything. He's just for the Protestants, and that's it. Full stop.
Why? Well, it preaches the truth, tells the truth, stands by the truth, stands by it. Won't die for the truth. No surrender man, good man.
Hello, how are you? How are you?
Is that right? That's a bit of cup now.
You have to climb around until you
That's right, that's right. I was only a youngster then. And this is the first school I went to. Here, the Ballymena Model School.
Happy memories when I come out there.
Billy Holmes. Billy Holmes. And Miss Bent. Yes.
Came through his hand.
That's right. Do you remember Miss Bent?
I do, Hannah.
And Miss
Perry's over there, yeah, and I'll be Peter.
Is that right?
90 as well as you.
Is that right? Is that right?
He's over there now,
And Leith, George Leith.
Jack Leith.
Jack Leith.
He's dead now, too.
Yes, and
Johnny
Watt.
Johnny Watt.
Wee Ricky. Remember Wee Ricky?
You know the other, you know what his right name was.
Yeah, that's
right. Here.
That's right.
We'll not tell these boys.
No, don't tell them, please. Those were happy memories.
Part of his success lies in his inestimable charm as an individual, his sense of humour, his sense of generosity, and his sense of fun. And this enables him to get on with those who are diametrically opposed to him, both in the religious realm and in the political realm.
No, I don't think so at all. And I believe that what is commonly called a right-wing unionist government would give far better treatment to the Roman Catholics of the north of Ireland.
I have found now that one section of the community is to be discriminated against, and that section of the community is the Protestant section of the community. And as a leader of that section of the community, I must go in the defensive for my community, and that's what I intend to do.
Genuinely, I think he believes that he draws a distinction, no matter what effect his words and actions may have on other people, between the theology of Catholicism, the ideology of Rome, and individual Roman Catholics. So that when it comes to him performing his tasks as a politician at Westminster or Europe, then he's scrupulously fair. And I think most people who've had dealings with him, either in North Antrim or in European matters, whether they be Catholic or Protestant, actually do say and comment quite favourably on the fact that he does make considerable efforts to be scrupulously fair and to work as hard for one constituent as for another, irrespective of their religion. But it does enable him to say, I hate Catholicism, I don't hate Catholics.
The DUP booklet claims that the North's Fair Employment Agency is ignoring discrimination against Protestants. Mr. Paisley says there's a vicious campaign by the agency, the British government, the SDLP, Republicans and the American government to keep Protestants out of work. He said the British government guidelines to employers was an attack on basic human rights aimed at Protestants. His Council for Civil Liberties for Protestants will examine complaints of discrimination.
We will not have the destiny of Ulster settled in Dublin. We will settle the destiny of Ulster.
I think Paisley, if he does have a vision, it's a flawed one, because essentially he can't make up his mind whether he's interested in power or protest. My guess is that he's more interested in protest.
The police broke their word, that's all. They said I could go quietly to...
He sees himself sometimes as the law and order man.
That's exactly right.
On the other hand, he also has a vision of himself as a victim.
I'm now under arrest, gentlemen. I have to go, and they would tell you that I was trying to get away from them.
Can you just tell us what your feelings are, Mr. Paisley?
My feelings are that I'm very disappointed that the police tell lies. Well, I'm afraid you'll have to arrest us if that's so.
And you can see when he launches his protests, he then complains afterwards that he was manhandled or roughly treated or badly treated, victimized by the authorities.
I have acted and behaved according to my conscience, and I think it's a proper thing to have friendship, to build friendship and to cooperation.
Where is there? What man there? Do you see that fellow there? He's trying to hide. There I'm making an accusation against him. Yes, that he threatened me. He did. He said he would. He took off his coat and told me.
I did not take off.
As far as I was saying, Mr. Paisley just came in and he wanted to use his shoulders, and he used his shoulders once on me. I allowed for a mistake once. He used it a second time on me, so I said, okay, and I gave him a good shoulder back and he went over the sofa. Hard luck on Mr. Paisley. I stood up better than he did. I mean, his stamina may not be as good as his mouth is, you know.
This is the paradox at the heart of him. On one stage, he is for imposing authority. On the other, he sees himself as the man that authority is unfairly imposed on.
And this poster is simply saying that if the Constitution is overthrown by force, and if Captain O'Neill continues to sell us out to the forces of anarchy and of popery and republicanism, then we will be prepared to do what our fathers did and resist this with all the determination that we can muster.
Do you mean by force?
Yes, if force is used against us, we certainly will defend ourselves by force.
Well, there is a sequence of violence. I think that psychologists have drawn attention to this, and it's universal. It applies everywhere where there's violence. It applied in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And I think this is what I call the sequence of sectarianism. For example, it will start with verbal abuse, all kinds of propaganda. The Jews were subjected to this as soon as Hitler achieved power in 1933. The Catholics in Northern Ireland have been subjected to verbal abuse, such as we saw at Strasbourg when Ian Paisley opposed the Pope's visit to the Parliament at Strasbourg. Verbal abuse then leads to alienation and ostracism. If I could quote from Martin Smith says in one of his pamphlets that loyalists will neither work with, nor live with, nor employ Roman Catholics, because the assumption is that the Roman Catholics are all disloyal. So that's alienation and ostracism, and then violence. See, violence against the population or the people who are the object of this verbal abuse. And in Hitler's Germany, it finished in the gas chambers. Here it finishes with things like the Schenkel butchers, butchering 24 innocent and defenseless people. So that sequence is universal and it's dangerous. And the sooner people recognize that, the better. Perfectly respectable people will say, well, I don't trust Roman Catholics. They don't realize that they're taking the first step, which would lead eventually to things like the gas chambers or the Schenkel butchers.
The burned out houses stand today as proof of that fear. They were set ablaze last night, many of them by the very people who lived in them. And while the families tried to remove their belongings, a machine gunner opened fire on them. 3 people, including a child, were injured. This was in Farrington Gardens in the Ardoyne. But in most cases, people didn't wait for the violence to actually happen. The threats were enough to make them move. The city is polarizing in sectarian terms all over again. The Protestants want to be together, to be out of the mixed streets, and so do the Catholics. And there seems no doubt that there are more families moving now than even in 1969. What causes extra resentment and heightens the tension is that the troops simply watch the evacuations happen. Those who are moving say the soldiers are in Ulster to prevent exactly this sort of intimidation.
And then we, having been refused our democratic rights, will then arm ourselves for the inevitable battle that must come.
There's absolutely no doubt that the effect of his actions and his words over the last certainly the last 20, 25 years or so,
Let us face it.
has been to incite and occasionally inspire people to actually go out and commit violent acts, including murder. There's no doubt about that.
There was the fact that a man in a court statement said that he was sorry that he had ever heard of that man, Paisley, and this man was being tried for one of the bombings, thought at the time to have been the IRA, but which subsequently turned out to have been UVF bombings intended to bring down the government of Terence O'Neill. Now, what he and other early paramilitaries made it clear they meant was that Paisley's sermons and Paisley political speeches had fomented in them that paramilitary zeal for bombing and killing. Beyond that, it's not possible to go without fear of libel.
Well, that's a very small token. That's a token of many thousands of men, and also men supported by the womenfolk of Ulster and by the young people of Ulster. These people are going to stop the sellout. It's as simple as that. And they will stop at nothing, and I quote what Lord Carson said, they will stop at nothing if they're going to be handed over, bound and gagged to their enemies.
Ian Paisley's connection with paramilitary Protestantism has always been fairly obvious. He has not been at all shy about publicly associating himself with loyalist paramilitaries.
Well, all the loyalist groupings have an intimate connection. Northern Ireland is a very cohesive whole, as you know, and no loyalist body moves without consultations and support.
A recent example being when he was filmed talking earnestly to Jim Craig, the UDA man who was killed by his own people. He makes a point of going to loyalist paramilitary funerals. His connection is not by any means severed, in that he is still happy to be seen in their company, and in fact obviously makes a point of doing it.
Mr. Paisley said that the loyalist people have not turned on the RUC, but that Mr. King has ordered the RUC to turn on the loyalist people. He then reminded the RUC of the British Army officers who mutinied at the Curragh in 1914, rather than act against the Unionists.
I appeal to the members of the RUC not to allow themselves to be the political tools of King and his Dublin masters. The time has come when they should follow the example of the British Army officers at the Curragh. I repeat now my call for the loyalist people to get to Portadown on the 12th of July.
But among the people who died was a woman who was standing outside her burning house, and a Roman Catholic priest who was administering the last rites to a dying man. Paisley, how did he react to his church's destruction?
The Church of God will rise from the ashes, quite confident that the work will go on. All I would say is this, that all our churches, I think, will probably come under attack.
I'm not sure, but I think the IRA's calculation probably is that Paisley is much more used to them alive than dead. He is such a personification of the intransigence of unionism. He's such an obvious metaphor for the fact that, to back up the IRA argument that Northern Ireland is irreformable, because if a state can give birth to a man like this, who is based on not compromising, who's based on anti-Catholicism, then really the only way to deal with that is through violence. That's the IRA's argument, and to back that up, Paisley is an excellent help to them.
Some way back, the UDA's John McMichael.
If the circumstances are such that the United Kingdom government and the Dublin government are going to force us into an all-Ireland republic, that means resistance to death. Resistance to death. I hope you've got that message.
There will be a spontaneous uprising, certainly, all over this province.
Then the person with the strongest force is going to win this battle.
But there's one thing about the man himself which is been beneficial to Northern Ireland, and that is that he's essentially a bluffer. That he has threatened and he has blustered and he's marched people up to the top of the hill. But he always marches them down again, so much so that in the Loyalist paramilitary world, a long time ago, he was dubbed the Grand Old Duke of York. And for him, for them, he is a person who at one stage they were prepared to follow because they believed he was actually going to take them somewhere and that they were going to achieve something. Now they believe that Ian Paisley is really all bluster and wind, and that there's really no point in joining a campaign of his, whether it be a strike or whether it be a third force or whatever, because at the end of the day they suspect and believe that he hasn't got the bottle, the courage to follow it through.
I think too because, and this may seem strange to listeners in the Republic of Ireland, I think too because of his commitment to Protestant views, in a sense he has acted as a restraining influence on the much more dangerous paramilitary activism. This may seem strange to many people because they might feel that he's, in a sense, contaminated by paramilitarism, but I would want to argue that because of their commitment to a scriptural conduct, to honesty in their dealings, because of their repudiation of murder as a political method, they have actually restrained, to an extent, Loyalist paramilitarism.
But at the end of the day, it will not be her or Heard or Thatcher you will face the enraged man and woman of Ulster. Blessings go, praise him, all creatures.
Well, of course, Paisleyism is nothing new. There was Paisleyism in the past. Henry Cook was the prototype Paisleyite. Roaring Hannah made a profession of anti-Catholicism and indeed predicted that the papacy would be demolished in the year 2000. He gave a sermon and published a pamphlet to that effect. In 1857, I think it was, the Northern Whig, which was then a liberal paper, described the Orange Lodges as caricatures of Christianity. Like, Paisleyism is an extreme form, if there could be an extreme form of Orangism. It is Orangism in at its most militant. So I would say that Paisleyism is a caricature of Christianity. Very few Christians in this world, whether they're Catholics or non-Catholic Christians, would have anything in common with Paisley or his doctrines. He is certainly, in the world of Christianity, very much a minority, even in the United States of America.
He's always been acutely aware of the need to use folk figures in Northern Ireland Unionist and Protestant history on both the political and the religious side to further his own particular cause. He does see himself, in some respects, as following in the footsteps of some of the Reformation leaders, of some of Northern Ireland's political leaders. Edward Carson is one of the best examples. You might remember back in 1981, he set out on a protest campaign against the Anglo-Irish process. And what did he call that campaign of protest? The Carson Trail. And he followed exactly the same route that Carson had used back in 1911, 1912, with a series of protest meetings, and he ended up in the Ulster Hall where Carson had ended up.
And I want to tell you that Mr. Lynch is just as dangerous to the north of Ireland as Neil Blaney or Mr. Haughey.
So he sees himself, and he certainly projects himself, as being a repetition of these figures, with the same interest in preserving Northern Ireland's Protestant Unionist nature as they had. In other words, someone whom they can trust.
I'd like to tell the southern politicians to keep their nose out of Northern Ireland's politics. Let them get on with their own job. They have managed to almost liquidate the Protestant population in the south. And now they're looking to the north, probably with the same idea that they will liquidate the Protestants in the north.
Well, the signs are, I don't think, very good for Ian Paisley. The last 3 years, the years since the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed, an agreement which, as we know full well, is bitterly opposed to this day by the majority of Unionists in Northern Ireland because of the role it gives to the Irish Republic in the governing of Northern Ireland, have exposed a number of Achilles' heels in Ian Paisley.
With the by-elections on the agreement just 5 days away...
Firstly, there is the fact that the protesters failed completely to move the agreement.
Ballymena is the citadel of Paisleyism, but today his unionist rival James Molyneux was heralded as his staunchest friend.
And he, together with the official unionist leader James Molyneux, had promised to lead the protest campaign and bring the agreement thundering down.
This afternoon, nothing will break
that hasn't happened.
that unity.
And it hasn't happened for one basic reason, I think, that is Paisley's bluff, if you like, had been called by the Anglo-Irish Agreement, because unlike the 1974 power-sharing arrangement, the Anglo-Irish Agreement was fairly impervious to grassroots unionist pressure. And that the sort of campaign and the level of violence, I think, that would have been necessary back in 1986 to move the Anglo-Irish Agreement would have been such an immense scale that I think at the end of the day Ian Paisley shirked from taking that particular risk.
To defeat this conspiracy and to say no today, no tomorrow, no forever.
The heartland of Paisleyism is the Free Presbyterian Church, and it's based on not compromising. He preaches against compromising every Sunday, and his congregation expect that from him. This is the problem for people who would hope to see in Paisley as perhaps the man who someday might lead the Protestants into a settlement with the Catholics, either in the north or in the south. The fact is that Paisley sees this not as a political battle, but as a religious war. In other words, his enemy is the Catholic Church. Because of that, I can't conceive that he would ever get into a situation where he is compromising and cooperating with Catholics. Because of that, really, you've got a man whose career has been based on no compromise and will end without compromise.
Praise in above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son,